It is now my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker, Curt Colliier. Curt has been one of the 3 leaders here at the New York Society for Ethical Culture for the last 4 years. Before coming to NYSEC, Curt served as the leader for the Riverdale Yonkers Society for Ethical Culture from 1999 through 2008. Curt has written extensively on ethical culture and on behalf of the American Ethical Union's Growth and Development Team is a frequent guest speaker to groups considering joining the movement. He is the founder of Just Matrimony, promoting marriage equality for gays and lesbians, and served as co-mentor for the Humanist Institute and the Humanist in Leadership training programs. Putting his environmental ethics into action, Curt is the Deputy Director for Groundwork USA, an organization that works on projects for urban renewal and environmental protection. Curt's topic today is Tale of Turtles and Tigers, the Narrowest Spiritual Path. Curt Colliier.
How are y'all doing? You enjoying the cold weather? As an environmentalist, I have to tell you it's really good for removing invasive species. So I'm happy for it. It makes a great spring. So bring it on, as we say. Very happy. It wasn't cold enough. That always scares us because the temperature is rising. We need a good cold winter. So hate to tell you about that. Unfortunately, because of the hurricane that destroyed part of our house, we lost a lot of our insulation. Well, my heating oil froze, so it turned off this thing y'all have here in the north called an oil heater, an oil boiler, so there's no heat in my house, which then of course froze all my water pipes, so it's been really fun, but I don't know. It took me 4 days to notice that the thing wasn't working. Shows you how low we keep the temperature in our house. William Carlos Williams was a famous poet, of course, in New Jersey. He was a dentist. He used to write a lot of his poems in the back of his prescription pads. And once went to a conference in which there was him who was going to give a presentation on his poems, and then there was a workshop about explaining what his poems were about. And then more people were going to the workshop than came to hear William Carlos Williams read his own poems. But in a way that makes sense because a lot of times when we think about literature, sometimes what the writer thinks they're trying to do may not be the whole picture. And critics tell us again and again that it's okay for us to ask broader questions about what a piece of literature may mean or try to understand it. You know, because people are sometimes so immersed in a certain milieu that they don't see the themes that they're working in. And it takes other people, perhaps, who are not caught in that to step back and to look and paint a broader picture and to help us understand exactly what's going on. That may be true of the recent movie adaptation of Jan Martel's book, Life of Pi. How many of you, first of all, have read the book, Life of Pi? Quite a number of you. And how many of you have seen the movie? Okay, spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you a lot about what the movie is about. Sorry about that. If the book's been out since 2001, you should know. I was actually given the book as a birthday present in 2002 by a member of the society in Riverdale, a well-read couple by the name of the Rosenfields, who I dearly love. And they gave me a copy of the book, and I remember originally reading it and going, well, that was interesting. And I thought about the book from time to time and never kind of went into it. I thought Ang Lee's presentation of the book, his cinema adaptation, is gorgeous. First of all, if you haven't seen it, leave today after my talk because you're going to be so inspired. Go down to the cinema and see it before it leaves the big screen. If you see it on a small screen, it won't be the same because it's visually such a gorgeous movie. I mean, he did such a fantastic job in the visual imagery. He just pulls it all together so beautifully. The movie, of course, is also a slight adaptation of the original Martel novel. Martel, of course, was a Spanish writer who moved to Canada and has kind of worked on a number of objects and kind of told people why he wrote the play, but once again, the novel. But once again, we can look at the broader themes. In fact, that's what Ang Lee did when he adapted for the movie. Essentially, the story is about a young man whose name is Piscine, which means he was named after the French word for swimming pool. He's from India. his uncle, who was a big swimmer, had gone to the most beautiful swimming pool in France, and it was called, he saw the word piscine, came back, told the family about it, and they named their son after that word for swimming pool. Of course, he got teased enormously by the name piscine, because it sounds like pissing in English, right, pissing. And so he changed his name to Pi because of the mathematical number, and amazed all of his schoolmates by being able to go 3.1415, and then continued on and on and on while people were screaming as he got every single one of the numbers correct. So from then on in, he's known as Pi. Pi, of course, is a real interesting and curious young boy. He, of course, is Hindu, raised in a devout Hindu family. His father, of course, his mother was devout. His father was not believing in religion at all, and thought it was one of the things that was keeping Indian people down. The young boy then becomes interested in Christianity, he becomes interested in Judaism, and eventually converts to all of them. His father keeps saying, well, you only need 2 more and you never have to work a day because you'll just go from holiday to holiday. I thought that was a good thing, right? If I were saying, you know, I'm Jewish, Christian, Muslim, I could get the whole, you could park anywhere in New York after that. That would be really great because you get all the holidays. Unfortunately, his father says that they're living in kind of an old French colonial area of India, that the zoo that their family owned is not doing really well, and then his father decides to take all of their animals, put them on a ship, and ship them to Canada and start a new life, hopefully better economic. They're above the Mariana Trench, sailing on their way from India towards Canada, when unfortunately they hit a massive storm. And then there's this gorgeous scene of him going outside in this massive ship pitching in the dark, and these massive waves, and lightning crashing all around. Unfortunately, something happens, and the ship begins to break apart. The young man tries to rescue his family, doesn't make it back down to there because the compartments were flooding. Gets thrown overboard by some people who try to protect him, and gets put into a lifeboat. Now, his family, of course, were vegetarians, and there was this great scene where way before this had happened, they were in this line with the cooks, and the cook decides to serve them whatever slop he had, and they said, I'm sorry, we don't eat meat, and he doesn't really care. He's really nasty throughout the novel. But there are other sailors who try to be nice, so we see that there are 2 kinds of ways that human beings can have it. So the young man gets pitched into the water in this massive storm. The lifeboat falls dramatically. He almost gets away from it, and he clings onto it. And while he's there, he's screaming and yelling in the dark as this big massive ship collapses into the water. And he's hoping for some people. And the first person who comes, the first being that comes, is the tiger, Richard Parker. They named the line Richard Parker after misinterpretation, because the people from India didn't know the language, and they thought that the man who brought him, that was the name of the tiger. So anyway, eventually the tiger, he's trying to stop the tiger because he realizes that's not in a good place to see, and he saw how vicious the tiger can be in killing other animals. He decides to put him to stop him from getting the boat, and of course he can't. Then an orangutan appears. By the way, I'm sorry to jump around, but painting imagery. When the lifeboat is falling, a zebra attempts to jump into the lifeboat as well, breaks its leg, and just sit there writhing in pain. So now there's a zebra, there is an orangutan, and then what happens, of course, is they're all stuck on this boat. Well, then a hyena appears because the boat has a covering on it, like they did to keep the water out of it. You know, a storm, you cover the lifeboat so it doesn't flood. And it has a covering on it, and a hyena comes up and starts attacking the zebra. And they're all trying to stop the hyena, and they can, but eventually the hyena kills the zebra. The baboon then strikes down and kills the hyena in this, because the hyena started to attack him. But then the tiger, of course, kills them all. So it's this really interesting kind of horrible scene that happens, and it's stuck with this Pi and this creature on the boat. They're adrift for many, 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 many days, and of course, Pi has to escape from the tiger, so they're only on probably a traditional 30-foot lifeboat, and jumps basically into the water, puts all the boards together in the kind of life jackets, and creates another little pier on which he can hang out in the water, which doesn't really work too well, but he can't be in the boat with the tiger. So he tries to train the tiger, and of course, to get the tiger to be as much obedient as possible, and that doesn't work out as well. So then he says, well, you know, you can't really train a tiger, but you can learn how to manage it. So he figures out a way to kind of keep the tiger at bay. And they go on this tremendous long adventure. Eventually they come to a floating island, and they're almost starving to death in several different scenes, just stuck out there in the ocean. There's this gorgeous scene where Pi wakes up and the tiger is looking out, and the sea is not moving, it's totally motionless. And the stars above are reflected in the stars below in the water, and it just looks like they are in eternity. And the tiger is just looking off in the distance. And Pi tries to call him, just sees a little bit of twitch of an ear. The tiger acknowledges him, but something out there in the infinity was just so powerful for them. There are a lot of scenes like that. So eventually they come to a floating island. They find that they can live there quite happily. They can eat the roots. They can drink the water. But at night, the island comes alive and basically devours all the fish that are swimming in the pools of water. So they realize that they can't stay in this happy place. So they get back in the boat, and after a long time, of course, get rescued by some, they end up on the coast of Mexico and get rescued by some local people there. So the Japanese company that owned the fishing boat sends some reporters to try and figure out what happened to the boat, because it's really never known. And Pi correctly says he doesn't know. He's a young man, what does he know? But he just tells them the whole story about that, and they, of course, can't believe that story. Can't believe that he was alone in the water with a Bengal tiger all this whole time, and how all these things happened to him. They said, we need you to tell us something we can go back and tell our boss. Now, Pi then says another story. The story is that he fell into the lifeboat. The young sailor who had tried to be friendly to the family had fallen into the lifeboat. As it was falling down, he had broken his leg. That the cook, who represents the hyena, then decides to kill, or have him supposedly amputate the leg, but basically knows he's going to die anyway, and then uses his flesh for bait and eventually for food. When Pi and his mother is the orangutan, get upset, that when his mother gets upset, the cook and her get in a heated fight. They knock Pi into the water, and then his mother gets killed by the cook. When his mother gets killed by the cook, of course, Pi gets so angry that he comes on board and kills the cook. Now, he tells them those two stories, and then he asks the people from Japan, which of the stories do you want? Now, this was interesting in the crux of the novel, because it's about this telling of the story is years later, when a young writer comes to Pi, who's now an adult, and says, I understand you have a very good story, because I met a man in India who tells me you can tell a really good story, and I'd love to hear it. I'd like to make a novel out of it. And that, in fact, this novel will make me believe in God. And so Pi tells him once again this whole story and talks about the report. And then he asks the reporter, all right, I've told you two stories. One, this story about the animals and all the things that happen and how he tries to survive with the tiger. And the other about probably what really happened is that he went through a psychological split. He is the tiger. The young writer correctly figures that out. That what happened to him when he saw his mother killed, this young, sweet, religious vegetarian boy finds within him his inner animal that then kills the horrible cook, but then has to live with that on this lifeboat. How do you live with the fact that you're a murderer and you're not that person you ever thought yourself? It so personifies his own anger as the tiger. He is both the boy and the tiger at the same time, which is my interpretation of the novel. But when he offers those things to the Japanese crew and to the young writer who's listening to the tale, he asks them, okay, which one do you want to believe? Do you want to believe the story about the animals, or do you want to believe the other story? And of course, they ultimately all choose the story of the animals. And then Pi says, and so it is with God, and leaves it right there. So what does that mean, and so it leaves it with God? The people faced with two stories, one extremely magical and seemingly has a sense of purpose and all this kind of stuff and all those lucky things, or another which talks about human brutality in the face of us and our infinite space. Which of those would you rather believe in? And then as the writer anonymously correctly says, most people choose the God story, rather than face the fact that we are alone in the universe, that we can be brutal to one another, and it seems not to have any purpose at all, and we must live with those things. Now, that is a very modern tale, needless to say. A very good one. Go see it. It's lovely. It's just done so beautifully. In philosophy we call that theodicy, which is how do you deal with divine goodness in a world that has evil. That's essentially what theodicy is. And it's a lot about those kinds of things. But the novel does represent a big shift now, because we're talking not only about what it means to have disbelief. It used to be that people would try and prove God because there are miracles in the universe, or because the universe exists, we should all feel such tremendous awe. None of that is in the novel. What we hear in the novel is choice to believe that we are alone in the universe as human beings stuck, or that we're still part of some plan. Most people choose the plan, because they cannot live with the fact that we are alone into the universe. Now, this is a modern tale I told you because that novel could not have existed before Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin had a tremendous impact on modernity, and I love the fact that his birthday is coming up. I'm a big fan of him, of course, being an environmentalist and a scientist. But, of course, Charles Darwin would not have been possible in a way if there had not been deism. Deism was the belief by many that God had created a universe, and that basically, at the last second, zaps human beings while stepping out of the universe, because goodness, whole goodness and eternal goodness cannot be in the place with something which is corruptible. And so therefore, what God does is leave the universe. That if man studies the universe, he will find his own path back to the way of God. And that lifting the veils through science and understanding, in a way, is moving us closer and closer to the divine. So that was kind of deism of its day. Many people think of it as a non-religious movement, but it was a very religious movement. It's just the fact is you were no longer studying the Bible, you were studying the world. Think of the American version of deism, transcendentalism, right? That both Thoreau and Emerson rejected their pulpits and the Bible and all that kind of stuff in the church, and basically went off as Thoreau did by Walden's Pond, which is a great place to visit to this day. We should go to pilgrimage. Do you want to go there one day? Let's do it. Let's get a bus and all go up there. It's great. You go up to Walden Pond, and he's sitting in the universe studying ants crawling across the ground and all this thing in nature, because that will tell you more about God than anything he could have said in the church. That was the purpose of the book. So here we have a deist interpretation. A lot of the scientists, of course, in England were deists, and in France, and those people who were reading these novels. And then along come The Origin of Species. Originally, when it was published in 1859, a lot of the deists thought this was a wonderful text. This not only proves what we've been saying, because it says that God creates a mechanism that eventually can lead us to the development of man, who then recognizes God in the universe. It was not a refutation, they thought, about that. If you look at a lot of his earliest followers, many of them kind of believed that. Darwinism, of course, begins to infiltrate a lot of different kinds of things, like Herbert Spencer's social Darwinism. If you look at the Victorian novels of the day, there are a lot of examples of how Darwin's ideas work their way into the Victorian novel. I'm thinking of Thomas Hardy and Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Remember Tess? She's a young girl, and she comes with a family, and she's got riding the horse in the town, their poor family, and then the horse dies, and she blames herself. So she tries to get a job with this rich family who they think they're related to. Unfortunately, one of the friends of the family ends up raping her, essentially. She has a child, the child dies. She tries to bury them and baptize it in her home because her father refused to have a parson come. She then falls in love with one of the wealthier sons. On their wedding night, she tells him that she has been, deflowered and by this rape, and he will have nothing more to do with her. And of course abandons her. Her whole life is then ruined by this other young man, Alec, and in a fit of rage, she stabs him to death. She eventually tells her betrothed Angel what had happened, and as they're walking towards Stonehenge, it has all these neo-pagan types of things into it. She tells him the story, and in the morning the police come and she says, I have come to accept my life. What's interesting about that novel is that novel would not have been possible without Darwin, because it was talking about the brutality of the existence of the human and the human trapped in that space and all the things that can happen to us. And in a way, it is the survival of the fittest, that we must adapt to our environment. George Eliot, of course, Marianne Evans, of course, she wrote her old book, Middlemarch, about that, about a bunch of families in a small town called Middlemarch who are all living their lives the best they can. And some people still hold on to the ideal or the ideal of perfection or something good, and others accept reality. And it's really only those, if you look at the novel, who accept reality of their existence on earth as it is, not as is idealized, are the ones that are ultimately happy. So those kinds of novels would not have been possible, of course, without this. The problem with the deist view of the universe and others is, the more they understood Darwinism, the scarier it became. Because what they ultimately realized is that natural selection was not seemingly written by some kind of design process, but happened merely by accident. And the accident is what sets up a lot of the tension for the 20th century. That notion that we're here, not anymore theologically as part of some divine plan, but you and I are here by accident. Now, to a certain extent, the Romantics, even before Darwin had published Origin of Species, knew that this was coming, that somehow that they were engaged in nature, but that nature was capricious, not necessarily working with us. You know, it wasn't all some happy little glowing world, that we were somehow in a rage against it, but we had to somehow accept that. And it caused us a lot of pain to realize that we couldn't control nature. The Germans, Romantics, of course, called that Weltschmerz, right? World pain, Weltschmerz. The idea that we have to kind of wrestle with this thing that doesn't seem to be in love with us, this nature out there that doesn't seem to be love us, and we still have to make our way. The Romantic poets, one of my favorites is Percy Shelley's Ozymandias, and I brought a short version that you can hear that kind of Weltschmerz. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell what that sculpture well those passions read, which yet survives stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, look on my mighty works, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sand stretched far away. So here's the idea of Ozymandias, which is the Greek translation of the word Ramses II. There, Ramses had built this mighty thing in the desert and called himself almost a god, you know, like a human being that we're trying to be so great, and then all that's left is a pedestal that has those words on it, and nothing of him remains. Percy Shelley, of course, had married Mary Godwin, who became Mary Shelley, who wrote which novel? Frankenstein. Another kind of example of their fear that we do not have the smarts to control the new sciences that are coming about. In fact, the movie is more about human hubris, what we think we can do and what we think we can command. They had a very tumultuous life, Mary and Percy Shelley. They hung out together in Lake Geneva with Lord Byron, and they would tell each other sections of their novels and things like that. But these ideas that we were kind of not in control, and that it could be scary if humans were in charge and no longer kind of God in charge. If we were in charge, we would create, in a sense, monsters because of our own sense of hubris, begin to intensify. Nietzsche, of course, Friedrich Nietzsche, when he looks at these things, he says, this is ridiculous. This is exactly what we need to grasp. The fact is that forever the church is telling us that we should be weak and mild, and That's not who we are. We are now free, according to Nietzsche, to go out there and become who we are. We just need the will to do it. And that's the biggest problem with all of you, is we don't have the will to do these things, and we need to be able to seize our own definitions of ourselves. The danger with that kind of view, of course, for those of you who are probably psychologists in the room, is that the notion that we are totally in control of our destiny sets us up for something that might be called the narcissistic wound. Right? That's the definition of a narcissistic wound, that we are in control of the destiny, that we can shape reality to be what it is. A good example of that is the movie Citizen Kane, right? Citizen Charles Kane, who on his deathbed in Xanadu, that palatial estate there in southern Florida, on his deathbed, people rush by, and he says, Rosebud, you all know the movie. So everybody's on a mad dash to figure out what Rosebud is. And of course, they look through his entire life, his failed marriage, his secret mistress, who he tries to push into an opera career, even though she's not a good opera singer, her kind of emotional detachment for him, his grasp of power. He was supposed to have been Hearst, the play was based on William Randolph Hearst, and all this kind of stuff. And yet nothing ever really totally satisfies him, despite the fact that he has wealth and power and can force people's lives to do whatever he wanted. The definition of narcissism, that wound to make happiness happen in his life, the only thing he says is Rosebud. And at the very end of the movie, of course, he's had this snow globe. There's a view of this, off in the snow, this sled, as the young boy sled with the words Rosebud painted on the side of it. So actually what he meant was his sled, because the only time he was ever happy when he was a little boy and not in control of the world around him. A good example of that is Gone with the Wind, Scarlett O'Hara, because circumstances in her own life forced her to make choices that she was not prepared to in a way. And yet she then tries to create this much bigger world and to control it and to control relationships around it. So much so that, of course, she just kind of wrecks the lives of those around her. And that great final scene when Rhett Butler comes up to her and she's trying to make amends and put everything together and start his life. And he goes, frankly, Scarlett, I don't give a damn. Yeah. This is not the only danger, of course, the narcissist. You see, you're not like New York Society, you're so well read. Not the only danger, of course, that people have, and this is not the only thing. If we are alone to make our choices and to figure out who we are, we have that danger of the narcissistic wound, but we have other dangers as well. My favorite one is Erich Fromm, who wrote the book Escape from Freedom, who says that, if we do have to define who we are and what we should be like and what roles we should now play, if we were really given that freedom, most people would be so scared to take that on that they would escape from that freedom, hence the title of the book, and they would move to the nearest totalitarian dictatorship or idea that says, here's who you are and why you're here and what you're doing, because we didn't want to define ourselves. Fromm, of course, was heavily influenced by the existentialists of the day. Jean-Paul Sartre believed that. Sartre believed that there were two types of things in the universe. One are things which we create to serve some need. So I have an idea that I need to amplify my voice, even though I think I'm pretty loud. So we do this thing, we create it, and voila, the microphone and the sound system exists. So we know why why it's there, because the idea precedes the existence of the object. But there are other things in nature that just exist. So for example, trees and rocks and rivers, we don't have an idea, they're just there. And so Sartre asked the question, so where do we fall? Are we an idea that something greater being had, and therefore we serve some ultimate purpose, or do we just exist? And of course he advocated for existentialism, to exist, to realize that we have to make a choice. And of course Sartre thought most of us also would find that choice very difficult, because we had to question everything, question our sense of selves, question what history told us, question what our parents and religion and everybody had said, and to be able to live what he said in good faith, which is define myself. He said most people live in bad faith. Sartre's example of that was the play No Exit, in which four people find themselves in a room, which we later know is to be kind of hell. They can have anything they want, they're nice and happy, But what each of the characters in the room wants is for other people to vindicate something about them, to vindicate whether or not they were good or that what they did was the right thing. And of course, nobody in the room will do that, right? Because everybody's trying to get something from another person, and the other people are emotionally or whatever psychologically unready to give it to that person. And therefore they're trapped because they cannot just accept for themselves that they're good people. They cannot accept for themselves that they did the right thing. They're so dependent upon others to define it, such a thought, they're there. And here is that often misquoted line, which is said at the end of the play, but of course it's not exactly what was said, is that hell is other people. All right, you know that. So that was Sartre's kind of view of that one of the other dangers that we have is that left to our own devices and our own, okay, if we are on that lifeboat and we're looking out towards eternity, and if we do have to define ourselves for who we are and what we're supposed to be about, that most of us, just like in the movie The Life of Pi, shrink from that and hold on to other beliefs which essentially make us feel better about ourselves. There was a whole movement of literature called the Absurdists, started in Russia, spread of course into Europe. The Absurdists had the same problem in a lot of their novels, that what's the purpose of all this? If we are just here by accident, isn't it silly? I mean, they looked at the brutal kind of social pressures that existed in their day. And then all of that, of course, none of that makes sense. And then we're just kind of stuck here. Albert Camus was heavily influenced that by living in Algeria, looking at French control, looking at the politics of his day and the corruption that still mars Algeria to this day. He was aware of all that and said, it's just absurd. We just need, we're like Sisyphus, keep pushing up the rock up the hill, but then the rock falls back down again. And we push the rock up the hill and it falls back down again. So what's it really matter? Until the story goes that Albert Camus went into a town alone where they had the bubonic plague, and he encountered a doctor. And the doctor was trying to rescue people. And in the story of the plague, which he writes about this experience, he realizes that he goes to the doctor and says, what does it matter? No matter how many you try to save people, they are dying like flies. What does it matter? Why don't you just get the heck out of there before the plague takes you as well? And the doctor says that great humanist line, I'm a doctor, that is what I do. I'm here because that's what I do. It doesn't matter what it is or the enormous odds. It's how I define myself. And in a way, that was Camus offering solace to his own heart that he had there. So here we are, once again, in Pi's lifeboat, in the middle of the ocean. Every day we listen to the news and we look out on the world and we go, oh my God, we're so brutal to one another. We look at what happens in the stupidity and people taking machine guns and going to schools and blowing away little kids. And we look at ourselves and it's so hard to accept the fact, and you almost wish there was something out there in the universe that could somehow come to our rescue. And yet we know that that's not what we have to do. What's interesting about this notion that we're alone in the universe was picked up by the female philosopher Nell Noddings. Nell Noddings said, why do we always say that? We are alone in the universe, alas, alas. She says, we say that over and over again, and yet we're surrounded by people who love us, who care about us. We have relationships, we have children. And in fact, that's the wrong thing to say. We are not alone in the universe. We are here with others. And we are all on this, we're not one person on a lifeboat staring at eternity. We're connected. Okay, so we appeared midstream in the story or part of that, and maybe just by chance. But the fact is that we are here, she says. And therefore, our only response is not to despair and say, okay, I might as well just give up, but to care for children and to care for each other and to build that place. For her, of course, and for us as ethical culturists, and I love the quote that Dan gave, is how important relationships are then in this equation. If indeed what happens to us in the universe and our belief that we can make sense or bring meaning to all this stuff is dependent upon other people and right relationships, which we call them. I'm thinking of Henrik Ibsen's A Doll's House. You know, it's an example of a bad relation. There's Nora and her husband Torvald, and Torvald keeps treating her basically like an infant, and it vandalizes her. And she's just not even allowed to check the mail on her own, all this kind of stuff. She tries to kind of do a little business deal that goes wrong. She tries to hide it from her husband, and of course he eventually discovers this great thing, and he of course wants to just hide it. And at that point, Nora comes to the point where we all come in those kinds of relationships. She has to make a choice. Do I go back and be what he wants me to be, or do I say no, and despite the risk of losing everything, because in those days women lost their children, and she knew Torvald threatens her taking her kids away, but she at least wanted to define herself. So there's that final scene in the play of The Doll's House, where he's calling after her, and all of a sudden you hear a big slam. And I've always wondered if that was, did she kill herself? But obviously she could have gone outside and left the door, and she makes her choice. Archibald MacLeish in the play J.B. gives us a very similar kind of tale in the story of Job. And Job loses everything. And when he goes to God and says, why? And of course God says, where were you when I created the universe and all these wonderful things? And Job says, that's a stupid thing to tell me. And basically thinking about it, you know, what ridiculous. Just because the universe is so great, you created something, I should feel happy about it. So J.B. goes to his wife and says, we've lost everything, we've lost our kids, we've lost our home, we've lost our livelihood. And she basically says, listen, why don't you just blow on the coals of the heart, and by we shall see what happens. Which means we have each other, let's rekindle that kind of relationship and see what happens. So the first thing we know as people stuck on that lifeboat is the importance of right relationships. We have to make them work. We have to find a way to do that. That's the reason why ethical culturists always talk about right relationships. And not just one where people are dominating us, but where we are together as partners trying to figure that out. But it just doesn't end with relationships. We know that there's the world out there. I love the play Lauren Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun. It's a very good example of that, right? A family living desperately in a terrible slum in Chicago finally has a little bit of money. There's a chance. How many of you saw the play on Broadway in 1959? I love you people because people see the original play. You know, it's just like that. So there's Walter and Ruth and Turvis, their son, and their mama living in there, the mother-in-law living there. And they're trying to deal with the fact he's a cab driver, Walter is, and he's struggling, and finally they come into a little money. And they decide to buy a house in a white neighborhood. And they're going to move there. And they're going to put all their dreams of getting out of the slum and moving into this place and defining themselves. And Walter finally has money, and it kind of goes to his head, and he tries to scurrilously get around it, and of course that falls apart, and there are all these other characters. But in the in the story, of course, Carl Linder was his name, shows up, one of the white neighbors, and saying, listen, this is not a neighborhood for you. Tell you what, I'll give you a bunch of money and buy you out right now rather than move into this neighborhood. You know, don't do that. No one's going to be happy with that. It's not a place for you. And so the family has to think, what do? Do we accept the money and do that? In fact, Walter originally says, we'll take the deal because they lost all their money. At least they could recap something. But then they talk and they wrestle as a family, and they realize that every time they've lost that piece of earth, it became what others has to say. And at the end of the story, Walter says, with the help of his family, we're not going to do that. We're going to move into that neighborhood. We don't know what happens at that point because the novel ends, but that's a very good example of that. So here we are, on the lifeboat, in charge of ourselves, in charge of our own choices, stuck with each other, stuck with the relationships and the good and the bad of the things that we do with her, in an environment that's sometimes good and oftentimes evil in many ways. And yet here we are. So the choice is really ours. In a way, I said that the title of this talk was The Narrowest Spiritual Path. The hardest, in a way, is to accept that reality. That here we are, with each other, in the world that we've created, and the only thing we can do is to work to make it right. And it doesn't matter whether someone tells us we have to, it doesn't matter for reward, it doesn't matter for anything, it's It's just because of who we are. That is what we do. And we do it because we're with people we love, and we're going to try and make this right. In the 1980s, my nephew was a little boy, and he used to love Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And he watched that over and over and over again. I'll never forget, I was babysitting him once, and I always thought it was pretty stupid, actually. So anyway, I'm watching the movie Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which he probably played 1,000 times, as you know kids do, right? They get something, play it over and over again. So I was doing the bad uncle thing. I wasn't taking him out hiking in the park or any of those things. I stuck in the tape. And I'm sitting there and I'm watching Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And after a while, I get the gist of the story that was probably lost on my little nephew. And the story is about a bunch of turtles with really amazing abilities to fight. And so the turtles, realizing that they have all these gifts, want to figure out who created them. That surely there must be some grand master out there who put them there for some purpose, some divine plan to make them out. And they go, according to this in the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, they go off, try to figure out what that is. Why are we here and what we're all about? Then they find out that they're there by accident. That a scientist was fleeing from some other person. The scientist had this goop in their hand that actually fell into a sewer, that there were a bunch of tiny turtles down inside the drain, that the goop fell onto them and they genetically mutated into the powerful Ninja Turtles that they were. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are devastated by this. They're devastated to find out that they're not there for some fantastic reason. That they weren't some part of a master plan, that it just happened by accident and they merely just evolved into that place. And they're devastated until their rat sensei comes up to them and he says, listen, and this is the best piece of advice for any of us on this very narrow spiritual path. Do not let the humbleness of your origin, he says, belittle the greatness which you can become. Thank you very much.